Number 10. The Storegga Tsunami, the wave that may have haunted northern Europe. Around 8,200 years ago, far beneath the cold waters off the coast of Norway, part of the continental shelf collapsed. A massive underwater landslide tore through the seabed and displaced an enormous volume of water. The wave that followed raced across the North Atlantic and the North Sea, striking coastlines that were home to Mesolithic communities living near forests, rivers, marshes, beaches, and low-lying land. To the people who saw it, there was no geology, no warning system, no scientific explanation. There was only the sea rising into a wall and moving inland with a force no human settlement could resist. This disaster is known as the Storegga Tsunami. Its traces survive in sediment layers found across parts of Scotland, Norway, and other northern coasts. The sand carried inland by the wave was trapped in peat and coastal deposits, giving scientists evidence of a prehistoric event that must have terrified anyone living near the shore. The wave heights varied by region, but in some places the tsunami may have destroyed camps, drowned people, torn away forests, and changed the relationship between coastal communities and the sea. For groups whose lives depended on fishing, shellfish, boats, shore routes, and river mouths, the ocean was not only danger, it was food, movement, and identity. Storegga turned that source of life into a sudden predator. What makes the Storegga Tsunami so haunting is the world it struck. Northern Europe after the Ice Age was still changing. Sea levels were rising, coastlines were shifting. But the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, often called Doggerland, was already being reduced by water before the tsunami arrived. The Storegga wave may not have drowned all of Doggerland by itself, but it could have devastated remaining low-lying areas and accelerated the end of a landscape people had occupied for generations. Imagine living on a coast where old hunting grounds and pathways had already been shrinking year by year, and then one day the sea arrived all at once. This is where disaster begins to turn into myth. A community that survived such a wave would not describe it as submarine slope failure. They would remember the sea-crossing boundaries it had no right to cross. They would remember water moving faster than a person could run, boats smashed, fires extinguished, bodies carried away, and familiar ground made unlivable, able. They would tell children not simply that a wave came, but that the sea once rose in anger, that land can vanish, that the coast is not trustworthy, that the world before the flood was different from the world after it. Northern European folklore contains many later stories of drowned lands, sunken settlements, bells ringing beneath the sea, and lost territories swallowed by water. Not every one of these can be tied to Storegga. Myths are layered, shaped by later storms, erosion, local floods, Christian storytelling, and medieval imagination. But the existence of a real prehistoric tsunami gives those motifs a darker weight. It proves that in the deep past, the North Sea world did suffer an event dramatic enough to become ancestral memory if stories survived long enough. A wave that erases land does not need writing to become unforgettable. The problem is that oral memory changes. A tsunami witnessed by Mesolithic families could become, after centuries, a story of an angry sea spirit. After millennia, it might become a tale of a drowned kingdom, a cursed village, or bells underwater. The facts dissolve, but the emotional shape remains. Once there was land, then the sea came. Something human was lost. That pattern appears in many coastal traditions because coasts are fragile places. The Storegga Tsunami may be one of the real wounds beneath that wider mythic pattern. What makes this even more disturbing is that the disaster happened to people who left almost no voice of their own. They had no written chronicle to describe the wave. Their grief did not become a carved inscription. Their dead were not counted by a king. Archaeology can find the sand layer, but not the screams. It can map the shoreline, but not the moment someone turned and saw the sea moving toward them. Myth, if any survived, may be the only form of human record left. That is why the Storegga Tsunami belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It was a real wave born from a real collapse beneath the sea, but its deepest legacy may have been carried in fear, warning, and memory. It reminds us that coastal myths are not always childish fantasies. Some may be distorted echoes of nights when water erased the world people knew. Long before written history, the North Sea rose, struck the land, and left survivors to explain why the ocean had crossed into human life. The science is written in sediment. The terror may still be hiding in stories beneath the waves. Number 9. The Black Sea Flood, the drowned basin behind ancient flood stories. At the edge of Europe and Asia lies a dark inland sea surrounded by rivers, cliffs, ports, and ancient migration routes. Today, the Black Sea feels permanent, as if it has always existed in its modern form. But some researchers have argued that thousands of years ago, this basin may have been different, lower, smaller, partly cut off from the Mediterranean world, and bordered by lands where early communities could have lived. Then, according to one famous hypothesis, the sea broke through. Water from the Mediterranean surged across the Bosporus and poured into the basin, raising levels and drowning shorelines that had once held fields, paths, animals, graves, and homes. This is the Black Sea Flood hypothesis, and it sits in the dangerous space between geology, archaeology, and myth. So the key basic idea is simple and terrifying. After the Ice Age, global sea levels rose as glaciers melted. If the Black Sea was once lower than the Mediterranean, then a breach through the Bosporus could have created a violent inflow. To anyone living near the old shoreline, the event would not have looked like climate change. It would have looked like the world being taken by water. Familiar land could vanish beneath a rising inland sea, and villages could disappear under waves that did not retreat. The hypothesis remains debated. Some scientists argue for a rapid and dramatic flood. Others suggest a slower, more complex history of water exchange and changing levels. That uncertainty matters, because myth cannot be matched neatly to one event. But even the debate reveals something powerful. The Black Sea region did experience major environmental transformation after the Ice Age, and human communities around its margins would have had to respond to shifting coastlines and the loss of familiar land. Whether the water rose suddenly or gradually, the memory of drowning landscapes could have been real. This is why the Black Sea has been linked, carefully and controversially, to ancient flood stories. The Near East preserved powerful traditions of world-ending water, Sumerian flood tales, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, later biblical flood traditions, and many local memories of rivers, storms, and divine judgment. It would be too easy to claim that all of them came from the Black Sea. Flood myths can arise anywhere people live near dangerous water, but the Black Sea hypothesis adds another possibility, that one drowned basin may have contributed to a wider memory in which water became the image of total destruction. Imagine the survivors. They would not speak of sea level change. They would speak of the water crossing a boundary. They would remember hills becoming islands, paths ending in waves, and boats moving over places where people once walked. If they fled into surrounding regions, their descendants might carry stories of a lost land beside a growing sea. Over time, details would change, names would vanish, the old shoreline would become a mythic beforeworld, the flood would become punishment, purification, divine anger, or the ending of an age. What makes this possible memory so haunting is that the Black Sea is not an ordinary floodplain. It is a basin large enough to swallow a world. A river flood can destroy a settlement and retreat. A rising sea redraws the map. When water covers land forever, it removes not only houses but evidence. Archaeology becomes difficult because the old coast is underwater. Camps, villages, tools, and cemeteries may lie beneath sediment, beyond easy excavation. The people who lived there can vanish from the land record, leaving only stories above the surface and traces below the waves. This is the same pattern that makes ancient flood myths so difficult to judge. The most important evidence may be exactly where people cannot easily reach it. Drowned coastlines around the world hide parts of human prehistory. If early villages formed near water and water later rose, then some of the best evidence for early settled life may now be submerged. And a myth of a drowned world may sound impossible until the seabed begins to reveal that people really did lose land to the sea. That is why the Black Sea flood belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It is not simple proof behind every flood legend, but it shows how catastrophe can become story. Somewhere around the basin, people may have watched the water rise over a world they knew. Their explanation has been lost. Their words have been reshaped by thousands of years of retelling. But the image remains. A land drowned, a people fleeing, a sea that crossed its limit. The myth says the world was covered by water. The geology asks whether, for some ancient community, that was not metaphor at all. Number 8. The Thera eruption, the volcano that may have fed the Atlantis legend. In the Aegean Sea, on the island now called Santorini, there was once a Bronze Age world built around white buildings, sea trade, painted walls, harbours, storage rooms, workshops, and ships moving between islands. The people who lived there were connected to the wider Minoan world of Crete and the Eastern Mediterranean, a maritime civilization of palaces, merchants, rituals, and images of bulls, dolphins, processions, and gods we still cannot fully understand. Then the island began to die from inside. The volcano beneath Thera awakened, and one of the most violent eruptions in human history tore the island apart. The Thera eruption was not a normal disaster. It was a catastrophe of earth, sea, sky, and memory. Explosions blasted ash into the atmosphere. Pumice rained down. The volcanic chamber collapsed. The sea rushed into the empty space, and tsunamis may have crossed the Aegean, striking coasts and ports that depended on ships, harbours, and island routes. The city of Akrotiri, buried under volcanic material, was preserved like a Bronze Age ghost. Streets, houses, frescoes, stairways, pottery, and storage jars survived beneath ash, but the people themselves are mostly absent. They may have fled before the final destruction. The city remained as an empty shell, a world paused before its ending. What makes Thera so haunting is that it did not destroy only buildings. It may have damaged an entire maritime system. The Minoan world depended on the sea. Trade routes, fleets, coastal settlements, and island networks made it powerful. And a massive eruption and tsunami in the middle of that world would have shattered harbours, wrecked ships, covered fields in ash, disrupted trade, and weakened religious confidence. Thera may not have single-handedly destroyed Minoan civilization, but it almost certainly struck it with terrifying force. A society that believed in ordered ritual and sea power watched nature reveal a power far greater than any palace. This is where disaster begins to become myth. Later Greek tradition preserved stories of islands, divine punishment, lost peoples, and cities swallowed by the sea. The most famous is Atlantis, described by Plato as a powerful island civilization that fell out of favor with the gods and sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. No careful historian can say Atlantis is simply Thera, but Plato wrote long after the eruption, and his story was philosophical, political, and moral, not a direct disaster report. But the resemblance is difficult to ignore. A wealthy island world, maritime power, sudden destruction, water, earth, and memory of catastrophe. The link between Thera and Atlantis remains debated, but that debate is exactly what makes the case powerful. Myths do not preserve events like photographs. They preserve shapes. An island that was great, a disaster that came from below and above, a sea that swallowed what humans built, a warning about pride and divine anger. The Thera eruption gave the ancient Mediterranean a real volcanic wound large enough to echo for generations. Even if Atlantis was not a literal memory of Santorini, the eruption may have helped feed the imagination that made drowned island myths feel true. Akrotiri itself strengthens the feeling that the buried city reveals a sophisticated society with multi-story houses, wall paintings, drainage, storage, and long-distance connections. It looks advanced, beautiful, and suddenly silenced. Unlike Pompeii, where bodies show the final panic, Akrotiri feels abandoned before death arrived. That absence makes it more eerie. Where did the people go? Did they escape to other islands? Did they survive only to watch their trade world collapse? Did later generations remember the island as a place destroyed by forces too great to name? To people of the Bronze Age, a volcanic eruption could only be interpreted through the language of gods, monsters, underworld fire, or cosmic anger. The ground shook. The sea withdrew and returned. Ash blocked the sun. Thunder came from the earth, a mountain opened and consumed itself. No explanation in ordinary human terms could hold such an event. The survivors did what humans have always done after catastrophe. They turned terror into meaning. That is why the Thera eruption belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It was a real catastrophe in the heart of the ancient Mediterranean, powerful enough to bury a city, reshape an island, damage sea routes, and haunt memory. Whether or not it is the origin of Atlantis, it shows how a disaster can leave behind more than ash. It can leave an image, the island that fell, the sea that rose, the civilization that disappeared, the warning that human worlds are never as stable as they seem. Beneath the beauty of Santorini, the volcano is still there, and the myth of the drowned island still feels like a memory trying to survive. Number 7. The Helike earthquake, the Greek city swallowed in one night. In ancient Greece, on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, there was once a city powerful enough to lead its region, worship Poseidon as its patron, and command enough memory that its destruction became one of the most terrifying disaster stories of the classical world. The city was called Helike. It was not an imaginary kingdom or a poetic island invented to teach a moral lesson. It was a real Greek city with temples, houses, people, fields, wealth, enemies, and a place in the political world of Achaea. Then, in 373 BCE, the ground shook, the sea moved, and Helike vanished. Ancient writers describe the disaster with the kind of horror that turns history into legend. An earthquake struck at night, buildings collapsed, the land sank, then the sea rushed in over the broken city. By morning, Helike was gone beneath water and mud along with its inhabitants. Later accounts claimed that fishermen could still see the city's ruins under the water, including the statue of Poseidon, standing below the surface like a god watching the destruction he had allowed. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by retelling, the core event was real enough to haunt the Greek imagination. A city had been swallowed in a single night. What makes Helike so powerful is the connection to Poseidon. In Greek belief, Poseidon was not only god of the sea, he was also the earth shaker, the force behind earthquakes. Helike was devoted to him, and yet it was destroyed by exactly the powers he ruled, shaking earth and invading sea. For ancient observers, this could not feel like random geology. It felt like judgment. The god of the city had turned the city's own sacred elements against it. As an earthquake alone would have been terrifying, a flood alone would have been devastating. Together in a city of Poseidon, they became a mythic sentence. The disaster was later explained through stories of divine anger. One tradition claimed that the people of Helike had offended Poseidon by mistreating Ionian envoys who came seeking a sacred statue or temple rites. The details vary, but the pattern is familiar. A city commits an offense, ignores sacred obligation, and is punished by the gods. This is how catastrophe becomes myth. The earth gives the wound, the survivors give it meaning. A city does not simply fall because faults move and sediments liquefy. It falls because pride crossed a sacred line. It falls because the gods saw. Modern interpretations point toward earthquake, coastal subsidence, liquefaction, and flooding in a tectonically active region. The Gulf of Corinth is one of the most earthquake-prone areas in Europe. Soft coastal ground can fail during strong shaking. Land can drop, water can surge inland, and mud can bury what survives. Helike may not have sunk into a deep ocean like a fantasy city, but the physical reality is almost as disturbing. an urban landscape destroyed by ground failure and water in a place where people had trusted the land beneath their feet. This is why Helike has often been discussed in connection with the wider motif of the drowned city. Long before modern archaeology, people told stories of places swallowed because they angered divine powers. Atlantis is the most famous example, but Helike gave the Greek world a real case of a city destroyed by earth and sea. Some later thinkers may have seen in Helike proof that such stories could happen, and a city could be powerful, sacred, inhabited and visible one day, then lie underwater the next. Myth did not need to invent the fear. The earth had already demonstrated it. What makes the story even more haunting is the speed of loss. Many civilizations decline slowly. Helike's memory centers on suddenness. People went to sleep inside a living city and did not wake into the same world. Parents, children, priests, traders and laborers were trapped in a disaster too fast to understand. There was no time for orderly evacuation, no written warning, no scientific prediction. The same night that began with ordinary life ended with the city becoming a warning. That is why the Helike earthquake belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It was a real catastrophe, but its afterlife became moral, sacred, and legendary. It showed the ancient world that a city could be erased not by invasion, but by the ground and sea acting together like divine weapons. Beneath the later stories of Poseidon's anger is a geological truth. The coast can fail, the earth can open, and water can cross into human life without mercy. Helike became more than a ruin. It became a lesson whispered through Greek memory. No city, no matter how sacred, stands above the forces buried beneath it. Number 6. The 4.2 kiloyear drought, the climate shock remembered as divine punishment. Around 4,200 years ago, the climate shifted across parts of the ancient world. Rains weakened, rivers became less reliable, fields failed. Cities that depended on predictable seasons suddenly faced hunger, migration, unrest, and political collapse. To us, this is a climate event, something studied through lake sediments, cave deposits, dust layers, tree records, and archaeology. But to the people living through it, there was no climate science. There was no global model explaining why the sky had changed. There was only the terrifying sense that the world had stopped keeping its promises. This event is often called the 4.2 kiloyear drought. It did not strike every region in the same way, and it was not a single instant disaster like an earthquake. Its horror was slower. Rain failed not once, but again and again. Crops weakened, herds suffered, wells sank lower, grain stores emptied, families moved, cities received hungry migrants. Rulers who had claimed divine favor suddenly could not make the fields grow. That is the kind of disaster that breaks a civilization from inside. It does not arrive with one wave. It arrives as years of waiting for rain that does not come. The ancient Near East may have felt this pressure intensely. The Akkadian Empire, one of the earliest imperial systems in Mesopotamia, weakened and collapsed around this broad period. In northern Mesopotamia and Syria, some settlements were abandoned or reduced. Dustier conditions, drought stress, and agricultural disruption may have helped destabilize a world already under political pressure. The climate did not need to be the only cause. Civilizations rarely collapse from one wound, but drought can expose every weakness at once: food supply, taxation, loyalty, migration, disease, and trust in authority. This is where disaster begins to become myth. Ancient rulers often presented themselves as chosen by gods, supported by heaven, or responsible for cosmic order. If the harvest succeeded, the king looked blessed. If the rains failed, the question became terrifying. Had the gods withdrawn support? Had the city sinned? Had a ruler offended heaven? Had divine order been broken? A drought is not only a physical crisis in an ancient society, it is a spiritual crisis. When the sky refuses rain, the heavens appear to be speaking. Texts from Mesopotamia and surrounding traditions often describe divine anger through famine, dry fields, abandoned cities, wandering people, and gods turning away from human communities. But not every such text can be traced directly to the 4.2 kiloyear event, but the emotional pattern is unmistakable. When drought destroys a society, survivors do not remember only the lack of water. They remember punishment. They remember hunger as judgment. They remember the king failing to protect the land. Over generations, climate stress can become a moral story. That is what makes the 4.2 kiloyear drought so haunting. It may sit behind some of the oldest memories of collapse as divine withdrawal. A city falls, and later tradition says the gods abandoned it. A land dries, and poets speak of curses. People migrate, and stories describe exile. A famine spreads, and memory turns it into a warning about broken order. The scientific cause may be rainfall patterns, monsoon shifts, atmospheric circulation, and regional aridity. The human meaning becomes something larger. The world was judged, and the people were left to suffer. This kind of myth does not need to preserve dates to preserve truth. It does not need to say that a long drought occurred. It can say the gods closed the sky. It can say the land was cursed. It can say the fields no longer answered the plough. Beneath that religious language may be the lived memory of climate failure. Myth becomes a container for trauma too large for ordinary explanation. The most disturbing part is how familiar this should feel. Ancient people were not wrong to fear climate instability. Their cities depended on fragile balances between water, soil, labor, storage, and belief. When those balances broke, power cracked. The drought did not have to kill everyone to become legendary. It only had to destroy enough certainty that people began telling stories about why the heavens had turned against them. That is why the 4.2 kiloyear drought belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It was not a single monster, wave, or burning mountain. It was a long failure of the sky, a slow violence that emptied fields and weakened kingdoms. In the record, it appears as dust, abandonment, stress, and collapse. In memory, it may have appeared as divine punishment. And somewhere behind the oldest stories of cursed lands, angry gods, and cities abandoned by heaven, there may be a real climate wound, a time when the rain stopped and civilization learned that even kings cannot command the sky. Number 5, the eruption of Mount Mazama. The volcano remembered as a battle of spirits. In what is now southern Oregon, there is a lake so blue and so still that it looks almost peaceful enough to erase the violence that made it. Crater Lake fills the collapsed heart of Mount Mazama, a volcano that once rose high above the surrounding landscape before one of the most powerful eruptions in North American prehistory tore it apart. Around 7,700 years ago, Mazama exploded with a force that darkened skies, buried forests in ash, and changed the mountain forever. The summit collapsed inward, forming a vast caldera that slowly filled with water. Today, visitors see a beautiful lake. But beneath that beauty is the scar of a disaster ancient people may have remembered as a war between supernatural powers. The eruption would have been impossible to ignore. The ash fell across huge areas of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The mountain roared, burned, and emptied itself. Pyroclastic flows raced down the slopes, destroying everything in their path. The ground shook. The sky turned strange. Daylight may have dimmed beneath drifting ash. Animals fled or died. Rivers and forests were transformed. For people living in the region, this was not simply a local event. It was the mountain becoming a living force of destruction, a place where the earth opened and the world changed shape. What makes Mount Mazama so haunting is that indigenous oral traditions from the region have long been connected to memories of the eruption. Among the Klamath people, stories tell of a great conflict between powerful beings associated with the world above and the world below, often described through figures connected to the sky and the mountain. And in these traditions, the mountain's destruction becomes more than geology. It becomes a cosmic battle, a spiritual event, a warning about power, danger, and the sacred landscape. Modern science sees magma, eruption columns, collapse, and caldera formation. Myth remembers a battle that broke a mountain. This does not mean that oral tradition is merely a distorted scientific report. It is something richer than that. The story carries moral, spiritual, and cultural meaning that cannot be reduced to volcanic mechanics. But the connection between the tradition and the real eruption is powerful because it suggests that human memory can survive across enormous stretches of time when anchored to a landscape and repeated through generations. A mountain exploded, a people remembered. The explanation changed into the language of spirits, but the wound in the land remained visible. To survive such an event, people would have needed to flee ash, darkness, poisoned water, and devastated hunting grounds. A volcanic eruption does not end when the fire stops. Ash can ruin food sources, rivers can clog, plants can die, animals may avoid the region. Sacred places can become forbidden, dangerous, or transformed. For generations after the eruption, the collapsed mountain would have stood as evidence that something terrible had happened there. The landscape itself became a memory device. Every time people saw the caldera, they saw proof that the story mattered. Crater Lake is especially powerful because the disaster created beauty. This is one of the darkest forms of mythic memory, a place of astonishing calm born from unimaginable violence. The blue water hides the missing mountain. The quiet surface covers the collapse. The lake makes catastrophe look sacred. It is easy to understand why a community would treat such a place with awe, caution, and story. Some landscapes do not need temples. The scar itself becomes the shrine. The Mazama story also challenges the idea that oral traditions are unreliable simply because they are not written. Written records can lie, exaggerate, decay, or disappear. Oral traditions can preserve environmental memory when they are tied to ceremony, place, and identity. They do not always preserve dates or technical details, but they can preserve the truth that something happened, that it mattered, and that people must remember how to live near it. In this case, myth may have carried a volcanic disaster through thousands of years without paper, stone tablets, or instruments. That is why the eruption of Mount Mazama belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. Myths. It was a real volcanic catastrophe, powerful enough to destroy a mountain and create Crater Lake. But its afterlife may have been carried in story, a battle of spirits, a warning from the land, a sacred memory of fire below and power above. Beneath the lake's beauty is one of the oldest disaster memories in North America. The volcano is gone, the people who saw it are gone, and the ash has settled. But the story remains and the water still fills the wound where the mountain fell. Number 4. The Burial Crater Hypothesis, the ocean impact behind flood myths in the deep Indian Ocean, far from the places where ancient people built temples, cities, or written archives. There may be the scar of a disaster so violent that some researchers have wondered whether it survived in myth. The proposed Burial crater lies beneath the sea, and its interpretation remains controversial. It has been discussed as a possible impact structure, perhaps formed by a comet or asteroid striking the ocean in the distant past. If such an impact happened, it would not have looked like an ordinary storm or flood. It would have been the sky falling into the sea, turning water into a weapon and sending waves across coastlines that had no warning. The idea is unsettling because ocean impacts are among the hardest disasters to preserve in memory and evidence. A crater underwater is difficult to study. Waves erase coastlines, sediment shifts. Later storms, tsunamis, earthquakes, and sea level changes confuse the record. Unlike an impact on land, an ocean strike leaves much of its evidence hidden beneath pressure and darkness. That uncertainty is why the Burial hypothesis must be treated carefully. It is not accepted as a settled explanation for flood myths, but as a possibility, it opens a terrifying question. What happens to human memory when a disaster comes from the sky and strikes the sea? A large ocean impact would create more than a splash. It could generate massive waves, throw vapor and debris into the atmosphere, ignite fear across huge distances, and strike coastal settlements with water moving faster than any person could flee. To ancient communities, the event would have been almost impossible to explain. First, there might be fire in the sky, a blazing object, a sound, a flash, or a strange light. Then the sea itself might withdraw or rise. Then came the wave. The disaster would combine two of humanity's oldest terrors, the heavens breaking open and the ocean crossing into the world of the living. This is where the hypothesis connects to myth. Some traditions around the Indian Ocean and nearby regions include stories of great floods, sea surges, drowned lands, and destructive waters remembered through sacred or legendary language. It would be too simple to say that one crater created all those stories. Flood myths can come from river floods, monsoons, tsunamis, cyclones, sea level rise, and local catastrophes repeated over generations. But if a large impact did strike the ocean, it could have created a disaster dramatic enough to become one layer in that wider mythic memory. And a skyfire followed by a sea wave is exactly the kind of event that can become a story of gods, monsters, punishment, or the end of an age. The power of this case lies in the boundary between evidence and imagination. The proposed crater is debated, the dating is debated, the connection to myth is debated, but ancient memory is often built from events that science later finds difficult to isolate. A community does not need to understand impact physics to remember a burning object and a wall of water. A story does not need to preserve coordinates to preserve terror. Over centuries, the impact becomes a divine weapon. The wave becomes a world flood. The survivors become chosen, cursed, or warned. The event becomes larger than itself because fear gives it sacred weight. If such a disaster occurred, its human cost may be almost invisible. The coastal settlements made of wood, fibre, mud, and thatch could be erased without leaving ruins. Fishing communities could vanish. Shoreline camps could be washed away. Bodies could be carried into the sea. The survivors might move inland, bringing with them a story that no longer had a visible homeland. Later generations would inherit the warning, but not the proof. This is how myth can outlive archaeology. The story survives because the evidence was destroyed by the same event the story remembers. That is why the Burial crater hypothesis belongs among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. Not because it is certain, but because it represents one of the darkest possibilities in human memory. That some flood legends may preserve echoes of catastrophes so violent the earth kept only broken clues. The ocean hides its scars better than land, but that its sky leaves no witness except those who survive beneath it. Somewhere behind stories of fire, waves, and drowned worlds, there may have been a moment when something fell from above, struck the sea, and made coastlines remember fear for thousands of years. Number 3. The ancient comet and fire from the sky traditions. Across the ancient world, people looked upward and saw the sky not as empty space, but as a living realm filled with omens, gods, spirits, warnings, and danger. A bright comet crossing the heavens could terrify an entire kingdom. A meteor blazing through the night could look like a weapon thrown by a god. A shower of falling stones could become proof that the sky itself had opened. Long before astronomy could explain orbital paths, debris fields, and atmospheric entry, people still had to explain the moments when fire appeared above them. And when the sky burned, the story rarely stayed ordinary. Fire from the sky traditions appear in many forms: stars falling, burning stones, heavenly weapons, dragons of light, gods hurling thunderbolts, cities punished by fire, or strange lights before disaster. Not every one of these stories comes from a real comet or meteor. Ancient imagination was powerful, and symbolic fire can mean judgment, purification, war, or divine anger. But the natural world did provide events dramatic enough to become myth. Meteors explode in the atmosphere. Comets appear suddenly and dominate the night sky for weeks. Meteorite falls leave stones from the heavens on the ground. To people without modern science, these were not neutral events. They were messages. What makes this kind of disaster memory so haunting is that celestial events combine beauty with threat. A comet can look majestic, but ancient observers often saw it as a sign that the order of the world had been disturbed. Unlike the sun, moon, and familiar stars, a comet appears unexpectedly, grows a tail, changes position, and then vanishes, as it behaves like a visitor from outside the normal pattern of heaven. In a society where rulers claimed cosmic order, such an object could feel political, religious, and terrifying all at once. If famine, war, plague, or the death of a king followed, memory could bind the comet and the disaster together. Meteor explosions would have been even more shocking. A fireball crossing the sky can turn night into day. It can produce sound, pressure, heat, and falling fragments. If large enough, it can shatter trees, damage structures, or injure people across a wide area. Ancient witnesses might describe it as a dragon, a burning serpent, a god's spear, or a star that fell to earth. The description would depend on culture, but the emotional truth would be the same. Something from above had entered the human world with violence. This is where myth and catastrophe begin to blur. Stories of divine fire destroying cities or regions may reflect moral and religious traditions, but some may also preserve memories of unusual natural events, meteor airbursts, volcanic lightning mistaken for celestial fire, comet appearances followed by disaster, or actual meteorite impacts on a smaller scale. The point is not to reduce every sacred story to astronomy. The point is to recognize that humans often transformed terrifying events into meaningful narratives. The sky did something impossible and people gave it a face. The ancient world had many reasons to fear the heavens. A stable sky meant order, a disturbed sky meant uncertainty. Eclipses, comets, meteor showers, blood-colored moons, and falling stars could be read as warnings, because they interrupted the predictable rhythm on which ritual calendars and agricultural seasons depended. When people saw fire above them, they did not separate observation from meaning. The event entered religion, politics, and memory at the same time. What makes fire from the sky traditions difficult to study is that the evidence is fragile. A small impact may leave little trace. A meteor airburst may leave no crater at all. A comet may terrify observers without touching Earth. Written records may exaggerate or compress events. Oral traditions may turn a meteor into a monster over generations. Yet the lack of perfect evidence does not mean the memories are empty. It means the sky is hard to excavate. Archaeology can dig a city, but it cannot easily dig a flash of light that crossed the heavens thousands of years ago. That is why ancient comet and fire from the sky traditions belong among the disasters that may have become myths, and they remind us that the sky was not always a symbol of peace or divine order. Sometimes it was the source of terror. A burning object, a falling stone, a strange tail of light, or a sudden explosion in the heavens could enter memory as a warning from gods, an omen of collapse or punishment. Beneath some of those stories may be real celestial events witnessed by people who had no scientific vocabulary for what they saw. They did not know about comets, asteroids, or atmospheric entry. They only knew that for one terrible moment, the sky had caught fire, and the world below had to explain why. Number 2. The lost river floods of Mesopotamia, the water behind the oldest flood stories. In southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, civilization was built beside water that could both feed and destroy it. The rivers brought silt, fish, reeds, irrigation, crops, boats, trade, and the possibility of cities. Without them, Sumer could not have become Sumer. But those same rivers could rise without mercy, break through banks, drown fields, collapse houses made of mud brick, and turn the flatland into a brown inland sea. To the people who lived there, water was not only life, it was judgment, chaos, and the power of the gods moving through the world. This is where some of the oldest flood stories in human history were born. Mesopotamian texts tell of a great flood sent by divine powers to destroy humanity, with one chosen survivor warned in advance, building a boat, preserving life, and emerging into a changed world. The story appears in different forms: the Sumerian flood tradition, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later traditions that carried similar images across cultures. A divine warning, a vessel, animals or living beings preserved, waters overwhelming the land, a survivor who becomes the keeper of memory. Modern readers often ask whether there was one real flood behind these stories. The answer is complicated. Mesopotamia did suffer destructive floods, and archaeology has found flood deposits at some ancient sites. But these layers do not all belong to one single event covering the entire region at the same time. But the truth may be more haunting than one simple disaster. The myth may have grown from repeated river catastrophes, local floods so devastating that each city remembered its own world ending. In a flat land of mud brick and irrigation, a flood did not need to cover the planet to feel like the end of everything. Imagine a Sumerian city before the water came. Canals carried life through the fields, granaries stored barley, temples rose above the settlement, families lived in houses built from earth. Then heavy rains upstream, shifting channels, or river surges sent water across the plain. Walls softened, roofs fell, grain rotted, animals drowned, graves were disturbed. The same mud that made houses and bricks became the force that dissolved them. If your whole world was a city, its fields, its canals, and its gods, then watching it disappear beneath floodwater would feel cosmic. And that is why the Mesopotamian flood became more than a memory of bad weather. It became theology. In the old stories, the gods do not merely allow the flood, they send it. Humanity is too loud, too numerous, too disobedient, or too troublesome. The flood becomes a reset of creation, a divine attempt to wipe the slate clean. This is how disaster becomes myth. A river breaks its banks, and memory turns the event into a question about why humans exist, why gods punish, and why survival is never guaranteed. The geography of Mesopotamia made that transformation almost inevitable. People depended on water so completely that they had to ritualize it. Irrigation required cooperation, labor, authority, and timing. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Kings and priests claimed power partly by managing this dangerous balance. When flood control failed, the failure could become political and spiritual at once. A broken canal was not just engineering trouble. It could look like the gods withdrawing order from the land. The flood stories also preserve something deeper, the fear that civilization itself is temporary. Mesopotamians lived in cities, wrote records, built temples, counted goods, made laws, and organized labor. They had every reason to believe humans could impose order on the world. But floods showed the opposite. In a single season, the rivers could erase boundaries, ruin harvests, and reduce human planning to floating debris. The myth remembers that humiliation. It says that no wall, no king, no field, no city stands above water when the gods release it. That is why the lost river floods of Mesopotamia belong among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. Yet they were not necessarily one universal flood, but a landscape of recurring catastrophes powerful enough to become the oldest language of apocalypse. Beneath the divine boats and immortal survivors may be the memory of real cities drowned by real rivers, of mud-brick worlds collapsing into brown water, of people who survived and told their children that the flood once came for everyone. The myth made the disaster cosmic, but the fear beneath it was born beside the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization learned that the rivers giving life could also take the world away. Number 1. The Great Flood Memory. Why so many cultures remember the world, drowning across the world, in cultures separated by oceans, mountains, languages, and thousands of years. There are stories of a time when water covered everything, a flood sent by gods, a sea that rose beyond its boundary, a chosen survivor, a boat, animals preserved, mountains becoming islands, a world destroyed and remade. The details change from place to place, but the image returns again and again, humanity standing before water too large to fight. Why do so many cultures remember the world drowning? The easy answer is that floods are common. Humans settle near water because water feeds crops, fills rivers, carries boats, supports fish, and makes civilization possible. But water also destroys. Rivers overflow, storm surges strike coasts, monsoons return with violence, glacial lakes burst. That tsunamis cross shorelines without warning. Sea levels rise after ice ages and swallow land forever. A flood myth does not require one single global event. It may come from many local catastrophes, each remembered as the end of the world by the people who survived it. For a small ancient community, the world was not the planet as seen from space. The world was the valley, the coast, the river plain, the island, the fields, the graves, the ancestors, and the familiar horizon. If that world drowned, then the world had truly ended. A flood that covered one settlement could become, in memory, a flood that covered everything. The scale of myth is not measured in kilometers, it is measured in terror. After the last ice age, rising seas changed the map of human life across the planet. Coastlines moved, islands separated, river mouths shifted, lowlands disappeared. The places where people had hunted, buried the dead, gathered shellfish, and built early settlements sank beneath water. This was not one sudden wave everywhere, but a long transformation affecting generation after generation. Some communities watched old places vanish slowly. Others may have seen storms, tsunamis, or sudden breaches turn gradual change into catastrophe. Over time, those memories hardened into sacred stories. Once there was land, then water came, and only a few survived. This is why the Great Flood memory feels larger than any single event. It may be a mosaic made from many real disasters: Mesopotamian river floods, Black Sea shoreline changes, tsunamis, drowned coastal shelves, monsoon catastrophes, volcanic waves, and local deluges repeated across deep time. Each culture shaped the flood into its own moral universe. In one tradition, the flood punishes corruption. In another, it resets creation. In another, it explains why the landscape looks the way it does. In another, it preserves a warning. Respect the water, remember the old land, and do not trust the world to remain stable. The flood survivor is one of the most haunting figures in myth because the survivor is also a carrier of trauma. Someone lives because they were warned, chosen, lucky, or wise. They carry seeds, animals, family, memory, or sacred knowledge into the world after disaster. This figure appears in different forms because survival itself needs explanation. Why did anyone live when so many died? Why did this family continue? The flood myth gives catastrophe a structure. It turns random survival into destiny. What makes these myths so disturbing is that they may preserve not precise history, but emotional geology. They tell us how humans felt when water erased certainty. The fields became lakes, graves disappeared, sacred places were covered. The old map was gone. After such an event, a community did not only rebuild houses, it rebuilt meaning. Myth is one way humans rebuild meaning after the earth has proven that nothing is permanent. Modern science can explain floods through sea level rise, tectonics, storms, climate, and sediment. But explanation does not cancel memory. We now know that coastlines really did drown after the Ice Age. We know that tsunamis can erase settlements. We know that rivers can bury cities under mud. The ancient stories may not be literal global histories, but they are not empty fantasies either. They are human responses to living on a planet where water has repeatedly taken back land. That is why the Great Flood memory belongs at number 1 among the ancient disasters that may have become myths. It is not one disaster, but the shadow of many. It is the memory of rivers rising, seas advancing, storms breaking, and coastlines disappearing beneath generations of fear. Every flood myth asks the same question in a different language. What happens when the world we know is taken by water? The answer is always survival, loss, warning, and rebirth. Beneath the gods and boats and sacred mountains, there may be the oldest disaster memory humans still carry, the knowledge that the earth can drown its own history and that only story may remain above the waves.